A singer in one of Germany's most popular, successful pop groups, No Angels, has been arrested for allegedly infecting her lover with HIV. The band
One of Germany's biggest pop stars has said sorry in court for having unprotected sex, knowing she was HIV positive.
"I'm sorry with all my heart," were the words of a German singer who appeared in court today, accused of aggravated assault and causing bodily harm by having unprotected sex.
One of the stars of Germany's top girl bands has been found guilty of GBH for having unprotected sex with a number of men, knowing that she had the HIV virus.
The criminal law in England and Wales, which is used against people living with HIV for transmission, is the Offences Against the Person Act 1861. This is a law which is 150 years old, almost, and it was never designed to deal with cases of onward transmission of HIV. It was intended to deal with the kind of situation which we would generally think of as GBH, which is to say people who stab people, who hit people over the head, who throw bricks at people, who punch people, cause serious injury. It was never contemplated that it would be used in relation to the transmission of sexually transmitted infections, though there was an early case in the late 1880s where a case involving gonorrhea was pursued in the criminal courts. But that was 1888, and then there were no cases between 1888 and, to my knowledge, until 2003.
Increasingly, policymakers around the world have thought that by having a law that criminalises HIV transmission will have an impact on HIV prevention. And nothing could be more either misguided or myopic, because it just drives HIV underground.
We don't see any need to have specific laws to criminalise transmission of HIV. We also don't believe that people should set out to harm other people. And if anyone sets out to harm another person, no matter how they do it, then they should face the consequences of that. But it's our view that there are plenty of laws on the statute book that cover any instances where somebody sets out to harm somebody else.
I think there has been an agenda of trying to find a legal framework for criminalising HIV for a long time, and obviously there have been some very high-profile cases. It seems rather ludicrous to me to focus just on HIV if you're considering the risk to an individual of a chronic disease. There's been no such attempt to criminalise hepatitis C or even hepatitis B or other sexually transmitted diseases. You're criminalising an infectious condition, but you're not criminalising people who might give somebody flu on the tube, which in the case of H5N1 might kill them.
There's a part of me that understands the reaction to somebody that knows they're HIV positive and that still has unprotected sex, that doesn't tell somebody, that lies to people about their status. I understand that feeling of outrage and anger, that this is not a way to behave. I just don't happen to think that criminalising it and putting somebody in jail is the right answer to it, really.
You know, criminalisation became quite big at the same time that I decided I didn't want to hide anymore. In 2005, I decided I wanted to be open about my status. I thought that was the right thing to do in order to challenge stigma. I thought that, you know, the fact that you see, a white woman, a woman that doesn't look sick, a woman that looks probably like maybe somebody you know, could serve to challenge the stereotypes of who can be HIV positive. However, you know, on one side I felt enormously liberated. I felt like I don't have to live with fear. I'm not ashamed of having HIV. I am not living like somebody who is ashamed. However, you know, sometimes I am a bit shivering at the thought that maybe somebody, you know, from a few years back, maybe even before I was diagnosed but was already HIV positive, might come knocking at my door.
You'd be amazed how often people say to us, well, I want to get my boyfriend's attention, so I'm going to threaten to prosecute him, but I won't go through with it. And we have to explain, you can't really do that.
I know that some people at the time of their HIV or HIV diagnosis feel that they might want to prosecute somebody for having infected them. And my advice would be to not get involved, take time to deal with that diagnosis, come to terms with it, use one's energy to find peace with that diagnosis and channel that anger elsewhere, because I wasn't able to take control of it in that way, and it became, I wasn't actually responsible for the prosecution, and it became something, it was 2 years of hell.
I think the whole debate and the whole issue has been badly mishandled, both by the Criminal Prosecution Service, by the police, and I think many organisations and services have been left very confused about how to respond to it, because you're dealing with a very complex issue, you're dealing with what can be seen as a very moral issue, coupled with a legal issue coming in there, coupled with a personal response.
Prosecutors and police were jumping into this issue, but they didn't understand how HIV was passed on. They didn't understand the difficult questions of how people knew about their status and about how transmission occurred.
When prosecutions were first brought, little attention was paid to the scientific or the medical evidence. It was usually the fact that someone is HIV positive, that, say, for example, the complainant is HIV positive, the defendant is HIV positive, and therefore they just matched the two and said, right, here we are.
And there was complete confusion amongst people with HIV as to who would be prosecuted and for what. Was oral sex prosecutable? Was it a defence if you used a condom?
Actually, most people who transmit HIV, first of all, most of them don't even know they've got the virus when they transmit it. Those who do know that they have the virus are usually people who are having some kind of difficulty either admitting to themselves or admitting to others. So I think there's a hell of a lot of work that we need to do to support people in disclosure.
We're concerned about an agenda that singles out transmission of HIV out of all the things that can be transmitted from one person to another one. And we worry about that agenda. We worry about that agenda here in the UK, but we are very concerned about it right around the world, where it's part of a whole agenda to stigmatise people with HIV, to make them seem as though that they are different, that they are, in the sense, deserving a whole separate category of legal sanction, and that's very worrying.
Really what government should be interested in is reducing HIV transmission and increasing access to prevention and to care. And one of the things that I'm worried about, and I work in a public health department, one of the things that I'm worried about is that if people, if HIV transmission is criminalised, then actually that will turn people away from treatment and from prevention and from care.
I think criminalisation means that individuals with HIV are less likely to get tested. So we have about 30% of people with HIV we know in the country have never had a test. It certainly will impact in certain groups of people who are unwilling to be open about their sexuality if they happen to be gay or bisexual. Or in African societies are very heavily stigmatized with regard to HIV, and therefore, and disproportionately, the number of people who have been criminalized have been Africans.
I think it does adds a stigma to people living with HIV because the people end up living in fear.
You have to disclose, and with disclosure, there is also the risk of the reaction that you can get because of stigma and the ignorance that people have on HIV.
Very often women don't have a lot of control on when and how they have sex, and you know, being in this position makes you more vulnerable of not being able to disclose your status, not being able to negotiate sex. And especially if you are economically or psychologically dependent of your partner, then you're even more vulnerable. And if you don't, then one day you might find yourself in prison. But that doesn't happen because you are an evil person, that you want to give HIV to somebody. That happens because you're feeling so scared, and maybe you haven't had access to support, you haven't had, you know, that you can't bring yourself to tell. And I think that unless, you know, it is very difficult to bring that across.
An effective approach to the epidemic is about us as a society addressing the problem, rather than us targeting individuals for what's a population-based problem.
I think HIV has to be understood first and foremost as a public health issue, which means that any law that impacts on people living with HIV should be judged against a benchmark, and that benchmark should be, does it impede or assist in the prevention of HIV? If it might impede HIV prevention efforts, it seems to me that that is a bad law.
HIV is a disease. Nobody deserves it, and nobody is responsible for it. So if we accept that phenomenon, that it's 30 years, it's a disease that's come along with huge developmental impact, we can't therefore say, well, someone is more deserving or less deserving, or to blame somebody. It's just the world we live in today. So I think for me, HIV has to be embraced in its entirety, not feared. So it's got to be taught at schools. It's got to be spoken about in synagogues and churches and mosques. It's got to be part of our daily dialogue. And once we do that, when we embrace HIV and not run from it, we'll find ourselves in that utopian world in which there's acceptance.